Chapters 81 through 84 of Human Bondage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 81. At the beginning of the winter session, Philip became an outpatient's clerk. There were 3 assistant physicians who took outpatients 2 days a week each, and Philip put his name down for Dr. Tyrrell. He was popular with the students, and there was some competition to be his clerk. Dr. Tyrrell was a tall, thin man of 35, with a very small head, red hair cut short, and prominent blue eyes. His face was bright scarlet. He talked well in a pleasant voice, was fond of a little joke, and treated the world lightly. He was a successful man, with a large consulting practice and a knighthood in prospect. From commerce with students and poor people he had the patronizing air, and from dealing always with the sick he had the healthy man's jovial condescension, which some consultants achieve as the professional manner. He made the patient feel like a boy confronted by a jolly schoolmaster. His illness was an absurd piece of naughtiness which amused rather than irritated. The student was supposed to attend in the outpatient's room every day, see cases, and pick up what information he could, but on the days on which he clerked, his duties were a little more definite. At that time the outpatients' department at St. Luke's consisted of 3 rooms, leading into one another, and a large dark waiting room with massive pillars of masonry and long benches. Here the patients waited after having been given their letters at midday, and the long rows of them, bottles and gallipots in hand, some tattered and dirty, others decent enough, sitting in the dimness, men and women of all ages, children, gave one an impression which was weird and horrible. They suggested the grim drawings of Daumier. All the rooms were painted alike, in salmon color, with a high dado of maroon, and there was in them an odor of disinfectants, mingling as the afternoon wore on with the crude stench of humanity. The first room was the largest, and in the middle of it were a table and an office chair for the physician. On each side of this were 2 smaller tables a little lower. At one of these sat the house physician, and at the other the clerk who took the book for the day. This was a large volume in which were written down the name, age, sex, profession of the patient, and the diagnosis of his disease. At 1:30 the house physician came in, rang the bell, and told the porter to send in the old patients. There were always a good many of these, and it was necessary to get through as many of them as possible before Dr. Tyrrell came at 2. The H.P. with whom Philip came in contact was a dapper little man, excessively conscious of his importance. He treated the clerks with condescension and patently resented the familiarity of older students who had been his contemporaries and did not use him with the respect he felt his present position demanded. He set about the cases. A clerk helped him. The patients streamed in. The men came first. Chronic bronchitis, a nasty aching cough, was what they chiefly suffered from. One went to the H.P. and the other to the clerk, handing in their letters. If they were going on well, the words Rep. 14 were written on them, and they went to the dispensary with their bottles or gallipots in order to have medicine given them for 14 days more. Some old stagers held back so that they might be seen by the physician himself, but they seldom succeeded in this, and only 3 or 4 whose condition seemed to demand his attention were kept. Dr. Tyrrell came in with quick movements and a breezy manner. He reminded one slightly of a clown leaping into the arena of a circus with the cry, "Here we are again." His air seemed to indicate, "What's all this nonsense about being ill? I'll soon put that right." He took his seat, asked if there were any old patients for him to see, rapidly passed them in review, looking at them with shrewd eyes as he discussed their symptoms, cracked a joke, at which all the clerks laughed heartily, with the H.P., who laughed heartily too, but with an air as if he thought it was rather impudent for the clerks to laugh, remarked that it was a fine day or a hot one, and rang the bell for the porter to show in the new patients. They came in one by one and walked up to the table at which sat Dr. Tyrrell. They were old men and young men and middle-aged men, mostly of the labouring class, dock labourers, draymen, factory hands, barmen. But some, neatly dressed, were of a station which was obviously superior, shop assistants, clerks, and the like. Dr. Tyrrell looked at these with suspicion. Sometimes they put on shabby clothes in order to pretend they were poor, but he had a keen eye to prevent what he regarded as fraud, and sometimes refused to see people who, he thought, could well pay for medical attendance. Women were the worst offenders, and they managed the thing more clumsily. They would wear a cloak and a skirt which were almost in rags, and neglect to take the rings off their fingers. If you can afford to wear jewelry, you can afford a doctor. A hospital is a charitable institution, said Dr. Tyrrell. He handed back the letter and called for the next case. But I've got my letter. I don't care a hang about your letter. You get out. You've got no business to come and steal the time which is wanted by the really poor. The patient retired sulkily with an angry scowl. She'll probably write a letter to the papers on the gross mismanagement of the London hospitals, said Dr. Tyrrell with a smile, as he took the next paper and gave the patient one of his shrewd glances. Most of them were under the impression that the hospital was an institution of the state, for which they paid out of the rates, and took the attendance they received as a right they could claim. They imagined the physician who gave them his time was heavily paid. Dr. Tyrrell gave each of his clerks a case to examine. The clerk took the patient into one of the inner rooms. They were smaller, and each had a couch in it covered with black horsehair. He asked his patient a variety of questions, examined his lungs, his heart, and his liver, made notes of the fact on the hospital paper, formed in his own mind some idea of the diagnosis, and then waited for Dr. Tyrrell to come in. This he did, followed by a small crowd of students, when he had finished the men, and the clerk read out what he had learned. The physician asked him one or two questions, and examined the patient himself. If there was anything interesting to hear, students applied their stethoscope. You would see a man with 2 or 3 to the chest, and 2 perhaps to his back, while others waited impatiently to listen. The patient stood among them a little embarrassed, but not altogether displeased to find himself the centre of attention. He listened confusedly while Dr. Tyrrell discoursed glibly on the case. 2 or 3 students listened again to recognize the murmur or the crepitation which the physician described, and then the man was told to put on his clothes. When the various cases had been examined, Dr. Tyrrell went back into the large room and sat down again at his desk. He asked any student who happened to be standing near him what he would prescribe for a patient he had just seen. The student mentioned 1 or 2 drugs. "Would you?" said Dr. Tyrrell. "Well, that's original, at all events. I don't think we'll be rash." This always made the students laugh, and with a twinkle of amusement at his own bright humour, the physician prescribed some other drug than that which the student had suggested. When there were 2 cases of exactly the same sort, and the student proposed the treatment which the physician had ordered for the first, Dr. Tyrrell exercised considerable ingenuity in thinking of something else. Sometimes, knowing that in the dispensary they were worked off their legs and preferred to give the medicines which they had all ready, the good hospital mixtures which had been found by the experience of years to answer their purpose so well, he amused himself by writing an elaborate prescription. "We'll give the dispenser something to do. If we go on prescribing mist, he'll lose his cunning." The students laughed, and the doctor gave them a circular glance of enjoyment in his joke. Then he touched the bell, and, when the porter poked his head in, said, "Old women, please." He leaned back in his chair, chatting with the H.P., while the porter herded along the old patients. They came in, strings of anaemic girls, with large fringes and pallid lips, who could not digest their bad, insufficient food; old ladies, fat and thin, aged prematurely by frequent confinements, with winter coughs; women with this, that, and the other the matter with them. Dr. Tyrrell and his house physician got through them quickly. Time was getting on, and the air in the small room was growing more sickly. The physician looked at his watch. "Are there many new women to-day?" he asked. "A good few, I think," said the H.P. "We'd better have them in. You can go on with the old ones." They entered. With the men the most common ailments were due to the excessive use of alcohol, but with the women they were due to defective nourishment. By about 6 o'clock they were finished. Philip, exhausted by standing all the time, by the bad air, and by the attention he had given, strolled over with his fellow clerks to the medical school to have tea. He found the work of absorbing interest. There was humanity there in the rough, the materials the artist worked on, and Philip felt a curious thrill when it occurred to him that he was in the position of the artist and the patients were like clay in his hands. He remembered with an amused shrug of the shoulders his life in Paris, absorbed in colour, tone, values, heaven knows what, with the aim of producing beautiful things. The directness of contact with men and women gave a thrill of power which he had never known. He found an endless excitement in looking at their faces and hearing them speak. They came in, each with his peculiarity, some shuffling uncouthly, some with a little trip, others with heavy, slow tread, some shyly. Often you could guess their trades by the look of them. You learnt in what way to put your questions so that they should be understood. You discovered on what subjects nearly all lied, and by what inquiries you could extort the truth notwithstanding. You saw the different way people took the same things. The diagnosis of dangerous illness would be accepted by one with a laugh and a joke, by another with dumb despair. Philip found that he was less shy with these people than he had ever been with others. He felt not exactly sympathy, for sympathy suggests condescension, but he felt at home with them. He found that he was able to put them at their ease, and when he had been given a case to find out what he could about it, it seemed to him that the patient delivered himself into his hands with a peculiar confidence. Perhaps, he thought to himself with a smile, perhaps I'm cut out to be a doctor. It would be rather a lark if I'd hit upon the one thing I'm fit for. It seemed to Philip that he alone of the clerks saw the dramatic interest of those afternoons. To the others, men and women were only cases, good if they were complicated, tiresome if obvious. They heard murmurs and were astonished at abnormal livers. An unexpected sound in the lungs gave them something to talk about. But to Philip there was much more. He found an interest in just looking at them, in the shape of their heads and their hands, in the look of their eyes and the length of their noses. You saw in that room human nature taken by surprise, and often the mask of custom was torn off rudely, showing you the soul all raw. Sometimes you saw an untaught stoicism which was profoundly moving. Once Philip saw a man, rough and illiterate, told his case was hopeless, and, self-controlled himself, he wondered at the splendid instinct which forced the fellow to keep a stiff upper lip before strangers. But was it possible for him to be brave when he was by himself, face to face with his soul, or would he then surrender to despair? Sometimes there was a tragedy. Once a young woman brought her sister to be examined, a girl of 18, with delicate features and large blue eyes, fair hair that sparkled with gold when a ray of autumn sunshine touched it for a moment, and a skin of amazing beauty. The students' eyes went to her with little smiles. They did not often see a pretty girl in these dingy rooms. The elderly woman gave the family history. Father and mother had died of phthisis, a brother and a sister. These two were the only ones left. The girl had been coughing lately and losing weight. She took off her blouse and the skin of her neck was like milk. Dr. Tyrrell examined her quietly with his usual rapid method. He told 2 or 3 of his clerks to apply their stethoscopes to a place he indicated with his finger, and then she was allowed to dress. The sister was standing a little apart, and she spoke to him in a low voice so that the girl should not hear. Her voice trembled with fear. "She hasn't got it, doctor, has she?" "I'm afraid there's no doubt about it." "She was the last one. When she goes I shan't have anybody." She began to cry, while the doctor looked at her gravely. He thought she too had the type. She would not make old bones either. The girl turned round and saw her sister's tears. She understood what they meant. The colour fled from her lovely face, and tears fell down her cheeks. The two stood for a minute or two crying silently, and then the older, forgetting the indifferent crowd that watched them, went up to her, took her in her arms, and rocked her gently to and fro as if she were a baby. When they were gone, a student asked, "How long do you think she'll last, sir?" Dr. Tyrrell shrugged his shoulders. "Her brother and sister died within 3 months of the first symptoms. She'll do the same. If they were rich one might do something. You can't tell these people to go to St. Moritz. Nothing can be done for them." Once a man who was strong and in all the power of his manhood came because a persistent aching troubled him, and his club doctor did not seem to do him any good. And the verdict for him too was death, not the inevitable death that horrified and yet was tolerable because science was helpless before it, but the death which was inevitable because the man was a little wheel in the great machine of a complex civilization, and had as little power of changing the circumstances as an automaton. Complete rest was his only chance. The physician did not ask impossibilities. "You ought to get some very much lighter job." "There ain't no light jobs in my business." "Well, if you go on like this, you'll kill yourself. You're very ill." "Do you mean to say I'm going to die?" "I shouldn't like to say that, but you're certainly unfit for hard work." "If I don't work, who's to keep the wife and kids?" Dr. Tyrrell shrugged his shoulders. The dilemma had been presented to him 100 times. Time was pressing, and there were many patients to be seen. "Well, I'll give you some medicine, and you can come back in a week and tell me how you're getting on." The man took his letter with the useless prescription written upon it and walked out. The doctor might say what he liked. He did not feel so bad that he could not go on working. He had a good job and he could not afford to throw it away. "I give him a year," said Dr. Tyrrell. Sometimes there was comedy. Now and then a flash of Cockney humour, now and then some old lady, a character such as Charles Dickens might have drawn, would amuse them by her garrulous oddities. Once a woman came out who was a member of the ballet at a famous music hall. She looked 50, but gave her age as 28. She was outrageously painted and ogled the students impudently with large black eyes. Her smiles were grossly alluring. She had abundant self-confidence and treated Dr. Tyrrell, vastly amused, with the easy familiarity with which she might have used an intoxicated admirer. She had chronic bronchitis, and told him it hindered her in the exercise of her profession. "I don't know why I should have such a thing, upon my word I don't. I've never 'ad a day's illness in my life. You've only got to look at me to know that." She rolled her eyes round the young men, with a long sweep of her painted eyelashes, and flashed her yellow teeth at them. She spoke with a Cockney accent, but with an affectation of refinement which made every word a feast of fun. "That's what they call a winter cough," answered Dr. Tyrrell gravely. "A great many middle-aged women have it." "Well, I never! That is a nice thing to say to a lady. No one ever called me middle-aged before." She opened her eyes very wide, and cocked her head on one side, looking at him with indescribable archness. "That is the disadvantage of our profession," said he. "It forces us sometimes to be ungallant." She took the prescription and gave him one last luscious smile. "You will come and see me dance, dearie, won't you?" "I will indeed." He rang the bell for the next case. "I am glad you gentlemen were here to protect me." But on the whole the impression was neither of tragedy nor of comedy. There was no describing it. It was manifold and various. There were tears and laughter, happiness and woe. It was tedious and interesting and indifferent. It was as you saw it. It was tumultuous and passionate. It was grave. It was sad and comic. It was trivial. It was simple and complex. Joy was there and despair. the love of mothers for their children and of men for women. Lust trailed itself through the rooms with leaden feet, punishing the guilty and the innocent. Helpless wives and wretched children. Drink seized men and women and cost its inevitable price. Death sighed in these rooms, and the beginning of life, filling some poor girl with terror and shame, was diagnosed there. There was neither good nor bad there. There were just facts. It was life. End of chapter 81. Chapter 82. Towards the end of the year, when Philip was bringing to a close his 3 months as a clerk in the outpatients department, he received a letter from Lawson, who was in Paris. Dear Philip, Cronshaw is in London and would be glad to see you. He is living at 43 Hyde Street, Soho. I don't know where it is, but I dare say you will be able to find out. Be a brick and look after him a bit. He is very down on his luck. He will tell you what he is doing. Things are going on here very much as usual. Nothing seems to have changed since you were here. Clutton is back, but he has become quite impossible. He has quarrelled with everybody. As far as I can make out, he hasn't got a cent. He lives in a little studio right away beyond the Jardin des Plantes, but he won't let anybody see his work. He doesn't show anywhere, so one doesn't know what he is doing. He may be a genius, but on the other hand he may be off his head. By the way, I ran against Flanagan the other day. He was showing Mrs. Flanagan round the quarter. He has chucked art and is now in Popper's business. He seems to be rolling. Mrs. Flanagan is very pretty, and I'm trying to work a portrait. How much would you ask if you were me? I don't want to frighten them, and then, on the other hand, I don't want to be such an ass as to ask 150 francs if they're quite willing to give 300 francs. Yours ever, Frederick Lawson. Philip wrote to Cronshaw and received in reply the following letter. It was written on a half sheet of common notepaper, and the flimsy envelope was dirtier than was justified by its passage through the post. Dear Carey, of course I remember you very well. I have an idea that I had some part in rescuing you from the slough of despond in which myself am hopelessly immersed. I shall be glad to see you. I am a stranger in a strange city, and I am buffeted by the Philistines. It will be pleasant to talk of Paris. I do not ask you to come and see me, since my lodging is not of a magnificence fit for the reception of an eminent member of Monsieur Purgon's profession, but you will find me eating modestly any evening between 7 and 8 at a restaurant yclept Au Bon Plaisir in Dean Street. Yours sincerely, J. Cronshaw. Philip went the day he received this letter. The restaurant, consisting of one small room, was of the poorest class, and Cronshaw seemed to be its only customer. He was sitting in the corner, well away from draughts, wearing the same shabby great coat which Philip had never seen him without, with his old bowler on his head. I eat here because I can be alone, he said. They are not doing well. The only people who come are a few trollops and 1 or 2 waiters out of a job. They are giving up business, and the food is execrable. But the ruin of their fortunes is my advantage. Cronshaw had before him a glass of absinthe. It was nearly 3 years since they had met, and Philip was shocked by the change in his appearance. He had been rather corpulent, but now he had a dried-up yellow look. The skin of his neck was loose and wrinkled. His clothes hung about him as though they had been bought for someone else, and his collar, 3 or 4 sizes too large, added to the slatternliness of his appearance. His hands trembled continually. Philip remembered the handwriting which scrawled over the page with shapeless, haphazard letters. Cronshaw was evidently very ill. I eat little these days, he said. I'm very sick in the morning. I'm just having some soup for my dinner, and then I shall have a bit of cheese. Philip's glance unconsciously went to the absinthe, and Cronshaw, seeing it, gave him the quizzical look with which he reproved the admonitions of common sense. You have diagnosed my case, and you think it's very wrong of me to drink absinthe. You've evidently got cirrhosis of the liver, said Philip. Evidently. He looked at Philip in the way which had formerly had the power of making him feel incredibly narrow. It seemed to point out that what he was thinking was distressingly obvious. And when you have agreed with the obvious, what more is there to say? Philip changed the topic. When are you going back to Paris? I'm not going back to Paris. I'm going to die. The very naturalness with which he said this startled Philip. He thought of half a dozen things to say, but they seemed futile. He knew that Cronshaw was a dying man. Are you going to settle in London then? He asked lamely. What is London to me? I am a fish out of water. I walk through the crowded streets, men jostle me, and I seem to walk in a dead city. I felt that I couldn't die in Paris. I wanted to die among my own people. I don't know what hidden instinct drew me back at the last. Philip knew of the woman Cronshaw had lived with and the two draggle-tailed children, but Cronshaw had never mentioned them to him, and he did not like to speak of them. He wondered what had happened to them. I don't know why you talk of dying, he said. I had pneumonia a couple of winters ago, and they told me then it was a miracle that I came through. It appears I'm extremely liable to it, and another bout will kill me. Oh, what nonsense! You're not so bad as all that. You've only got to take precautions. Why don't you give up drinking? Because I don't choose. It doesn't matter what a man does if he's ready to take the consequences. Well, I'm ready to take the consequences. You talk glibly of giving up drinking, but it's the only thing I've got left now. What do you think life would be to me without it? Can you understand the happiness I get out of my absinthe? I yearn for it, and when I drink it, I savor every drop, and afterwards I feel my soul swimming in ineffable happiness. It disgusts you. You are a Puritan, and in your heart you despise sensual pleasures. Sensual pleasures are the most violent and the most exquisite. I am a man blessed with vivid senses, and I have indulged them with all my soul. I have to pay the penalty now, and I am ready to pay. Philip looked at him for a while steadily. Aren't you afraid? For a moment Cronshaw did not answer. He seemed to consider his reply. Sometimes when I'm alone, he looked at Philip. You think that's a condemnation? You're wrong. I'm not afraid of my fear. It's folly, the Christian argument that you should live always in view of your death. The only way to live is to forget that you're going to die. Death is unimportant. The fear of it should never influence a single action of the wise man. I know that I shall die struggling for breath, and I know that I shall be horribly afraid. I know that I shall not be able to keep myself from regretting bitterly the life that has brought me to such a pass. But I disown that regret. I now, weak, old, diseased, poor, dying, hold still my soul in my hands, and I regret nothing. Do you remember that Persian carpet you gave me? Asked Philip. Cronshaw smiled his old, slow smile of past days. I told you it would give you an answer to your question when you asked me what was the meaning of life. Well, have you discovered the answer? No, smiled Philip. Won't you tell it to me? No, I can't do that. The answer is meaningless unless you discover it for yourself. End of chapter 82. Chapter 83. Cronshaw was publishing his poems. His friends had been urging him to do this for years, but his laziness made it impossible for him to take the necessary steps. He had always answered their exhortations by telling them that the love of poetry was dead in England. You brought out a book which had cost you years of thought and labor. It was given 2 or 3 contemptuous lines among a batch of similar volumes, 20 or 30 copies were sold, and the rest of the edition was pulped. He had long since worn out the desire for fame. That was an illusion like all else. But one of his friends had taken the matter into his own hands. This was a man of letters named Leonard Upjohn, whom Philip had met once or twice with Cronshaw in the cafes of the Quarter. He had a considerable reputation in England as a critic, and was the accredited exponent in this country of modern French literature. He had lived a good deal in France among the men who made the Mercure de France the liveliest review of the day, and by the simple process of expressing in English their point of view, he had acquired in England a reputation for originality. Philip had read some of his articles. He had formed a style for himself by a close imitation of Sir Thomas Browne. He used elaborate sentences, carefully balanced and obsolete, resplendent words. It gave his writing an appearance of individuality. Leonard Upjohn had induced Cronshaw to give him all his poems and found that there were enough to make a volume of reasonable size. He promised to use his influence with publishers. Cronshaw was in want of money. Since his illness he had found it more difficult than ever to work steadily. He made barely enough to keep himself in liquor, and when Upjohn wrote to him that this publisher and the other, though admiring the poems, thought it not worth while to publish them, Cronshaw began to grow interested. He wrote impressing upon Upjohn his great need and urging him to make more strenuous efforts. Now that he was going to die, he wanted to leave behind him a published book, and at the back of his mind was the feeling that he had produced great poetry. He expected to burst upon the world like a new star. There was something fine in keeping to himself these treasures of beauty all his life and giving them to the world disdainfully when, he and the world parting company, he had no further use for them. His decision to come to England was caused directly by an announcement from Leonard Upjohn that a publisher had consented to print the poems. By a miracle of persuasion Upjohn had persuaded him to give £10 in advance of royalties. "In advance of royalties, mind you," said Cronshaw to Philip. "Milton only got £10 down." Upjohn had promised to write a signed article about them, and he would ask his friends who reviewed to do their best. Cronshaw pretended to treat the matter with detachment, but it was easy to see that he was delighted with the thought of the stir he would make. One day Philip went to dine by arrangement at the wretched eating-house at which Cronshaw insisted on taking his meals. But Cronshaw did not appear. Philip learned that he had not been there for 3 days. He got himself something to eat and went round to the address from which Cronshaw had first written to him. He had some difficulty in finding Hyde Street. It was a street of dingy houses huddled together. Many of the windows had been broken and were clumsily repaired with strips of French newspaper. The doors had not been painted for years. There were shabby little shops on the ground floor, laundries, cobblers, stationers. Ragged children played in the road, and an old barrel organ was grinding out a vulgar tune. Philip knocked at the door of Cronshaw's house. There was a shop of cheap sweetstuffs at the bottom, and it was opened by an elderly Frenchwoman in a dirty apron. Philip asked her if Cronshaw was in. "Ah, yes, there is an Englishman who lives at the top, at the back. I don't know if he's in. If you want him you had better go up and see." The staircase was lit by one jet of gas. There was a revolting odour in the house. When Philip was passing up, a woman came out of a room on the first floor, looked at him suspiciously, but made no remark. There were 3 doors on the top landing. Philip knocked at one and knocked again. There was no reply. He tried the handle, but the door was locked. He knocked at another door, got no answer, and tried the door again. It opened. The room was dark. "Who's that?" He recognized Cronshaw's voice. "Carey, can I come in?" He received no answer. He walked in. The window was closed and the stink was overpowering. There was a certain amount of light from the arc lamp in the street, and he saw that it was a small room with 2 beds in it end to end. There was a washing stand and 1 chair, but they left little space for anyone to move in. Cronshaw was in the bed nearest the window. He made no movement, but gave a low chuckle. "Why don't you light the candle?" he said then. Philip struck a match and discovered that there was a candlestick on the floor beside the bed. He lit it and put it on the washing stand. Cronshaw was lying on his back immobile. He looked very odd in his nightshirt, and his baldness was disconcerting. His face was earthy and deathlike. "I say, old man, you look awfully ill. Is there any one to look after you here?" "George brings me in a bottle of milk in the morning before he goes to his work." "Who's George?" "I call him George because his name is Adolphe. He shares this palatial apartment with me." Philip noticed then that the second bed had not been made since it was slept in. The pillow was black where the head had rested. "You don't mean to say you're sharing this room with somebody else?" he cried. "Why not?" "Lodging costs money in Soho. George is a waiter. He goes out at 8 in the morning and does not come in till closing time, so he isn't in my way at all. We neither of us sleep well, and he helps to pass away the hours of the night by telling me stories of his life. He's a Swiss, and I've always had a taste for waiters. They see life from an entertaining angle." "How long have you been in bed?" "3 days." "Do you mean to say you've had nothing but a bottle of milk for the last 3 days? Why on earth didn't you send me a line? I can't bear to think of you lying here all day long without a soul to attend to you." Cronshaw gave a little laugh. "Look at your face. Why, dear boy, I really believe you're distressed. You nice fellow." Philip blushed. He had not suspected that his face showed the dismay he felt at the sight of that horrible room and the wretched circumstances of the poor poet. Cronshaw, watching Philip, went on with a gentle smile. "I've been quite happy. Look, here are my proofs. Remember that I am indifferent to discomforts which would harass other folk. What do the circumstances of life matter if your dreams make you lord paramount of time and space?" The proofs were lying on his bed, and as he lay in the darkness he had been able to place his hands on them. He showed them to Philip, and his eyes glowed. He turned over the pages, rejoicing in the clear type. He read out a stanza. "They don't look bad, do they?" Philip had an idea. It would involve him in a little expense, and he could not afford even the smallest increase of expenditure. But on the other hand, this was a case where it revolted him to think of economy. "I say, I can't bear the thought of your remaining here. I've got an extra room, it's empty at present, but I can easily get someone to lend me a bed. Won't you come and live with me for a while? It'll save you the rent of this." "Oh, my dear boy, you'd insist on my keeping my window open." "You shall have every window in the place sealed if you like." "I shall be all right tomorrow. I could have got up today, only I felt lazy." "Then you can very easily make the move. And then if you don't feel well at any time you can just go to bed, and I shall be there to look after you." "If it'll please you, I'll come," said Cronshaw, with his torpid, not unpleasant smile. "That'll be ripping." They settled that Philip should fetch Cronshaw next day, and Philip snatched an hour from his busy morning to arrange the change. He found Cronshaw dressed, sitting in his hat and great coat on the bed, with a small shabby portmanteau containing his clothes and books already packed. It was on the floor by his feet, and he looked as if he were sitting in the waiting room of a station. Philip laughed at the sight of him. They went over to Kennington in a four-wheeler, of which the windows were carefully closed, and Philip installed his guest in his own room. He had gone out early in the morning and bought for himself a second-hand bedstead, a cheap chest of drawers, and a looking-glass. Cronshaw settled down at once to correct his proofs. He was much better. Philip found him, except for the irritability which was a symptom of his disease, an easy guest. He had a lecture at 9 in the morning, so did not see Cronshaw till the night. Once or twice Philip persuaded him to share the scrappy meal he prepared for himself in the evening, but Cronshaw was too restless to stay in, and preferred generally to get himself something to eat in one or other of the cheapest restaurants in Soho. Philip asked him to see Dr. Tyrell, but he stoutly refused. He knew a doctor would tell him to stop drinking, and this he was resolved not to do. He always felt horribly ill in the morning, but his absinthe at midday put him on his feet again, and by the time he came home at midnight he was able to talk with the brilliancy which had astonished Philip when first he made his acquaintance. His proofs were corrected, and the volume was to come out among the publications of the early spring, when the public might be supposed to have recovered from the avalanche of Christmas books. Chapter 84. At the New Year, Philip became dresser in the surgical outpatients department. The work was of the same character as that which he had just been engaged on, but with the greater directness which surgery has than medicine, and a larger proportion of the patients suffered from those two diseases which a supine public allows, in its prudishness, to be spread broadcast. The assistant surgeon for whom Philip dressed was called Jacobs. He was a short, fat man with an exuberant joviality, a bald head, and a loud voice. He had a Cockney accent and was generally described by the students as an awful bounder, but his cleverness, both as a surgeon and as a teacher, caused some of them to overlook this. He had also a considerable fastidiousness, which he exercised impartially on the patients and on the students. He took a great pleasure in making his dressers look foolish. Since they were ignorant, nervous, and could not answer as if he were their equal, this was not very difficult. He enjoyed his afternoons, with the home truths he permitted himself, much more than the students who had to put up with them with a smile. One day a case came up of a boy with a club foot. His parents wanted to know whether anything could be done. Mr. Jacobs turned to Philip. "You'd better take this case, Carey. It's a subject you ought to know something about." Philip flushed all the more because the surgeon spoke obviously with a humorous intention, and his brow-beaten dressers laughed obsequiously. It was in point of fact a subject which Philip, since coming to the hospital, had studied with anxious attention. He had read everything in the library which treated of talipes in its various forms. He made the boy take off his boot and stocking. He was 14, with a snub nose, blue eyes, and a freckled face. His father explained that they wanted something done if possible, it was such a hindrance to the kid in earning his living. Philip looked at him curiously. He was a jolly boy, not at all shy, but talkative and with a cheekiness which his father reproved. He was much interested in his foot. "It's only for the looks of the thing, you know," he said to Philip. "I don't find it no trouble." "Be quiet, Ernie," said his father. "There's too much gas about you." Philip examined the foot and passed his hand slowly over the shapelessness of it. He could not understand why the boy felt none of the humiliation which always oppressed him. He wondered why he could not take his deformity with that philosophic indifference. Presently Mr. Jacobs came up to him. The boy was sitting on the edge of a couch, the surgeon and Philip stood on each side of him, and in a semicircle, crowding round, were students. With accustomed brilliancy, Jacobs gave a graphic little discourse upon the club foot. He spoke of its varieties and of the forms which followed upon different anatomical conditions. "I suppose you've got talipes equinus," he said, turning suddenly to Philip. "Yes." Philip felt the eyes of his fellow students rest on him, and he cursed himself because he could not help blushing. He felt the sweat start up in the palms of his hands. The surgeon spoke with the fluency due to long practice and with the admirable perspicacity which distinguished him. He was tremendously interested in his profession, but Philip did not listen. He was only wishing that the fellow would get done quickly. Suddenly he realized that Jacobs was addressing him. "You don't mind taking off your sock for a moment, Carey?" Philip felt a shudder pass through him. He had an impulse to tell the surgeon to go to hell, but he had not the courage to make a scene. He feared his brutal ridicule. He forced himself to appear indifferent. "Not a bit," he said. He sat down and unlaced his boot. His fingers were trembling and he thought he should never untie the knot. He remembered how they had forced him at school to show his foot, and the misery which had eaten into his soul. "He keeps his feet nice and clean, doesn't he?" said Jacobs in his raspy Cockney voice. The attendant students giggled. Philip noticed that the boy whom they were examining looked down at his foot with eager curiosity. Jacobs took the foot in his hands and said, "Yes, that's what I thought. I see you've had an operation. When you were a child, I suppose." He went on with his fluent explanations. The students leaned over and looked at the foot. 2 or 3 examined it minutely when Jacobs let it go. "When you're quite done," said Philip with a smile, ironically. He could have killed them all. He thought how jolly it would be to jab a chisel He didn't know why that particular instrument came into his mind, into their necks. What beasts men were! He wished he could believe in hell so as to comfort himself with the thought of the horrible tortures which would be theirs. Mr. Jacobs turned his attention to treatment. He talked partly to the boy's father and partly to the students. Philip put on his sock and laced his boot. At last the surgeon finished, but he seemed to have an afterthought and turned to Philip. "You know, I think it might be worth your while to have an operation. Of course I couldn't give you a normal foot, but I think I can do something. You might think about it, and when you want a holiday you can just come into the hospital for a bit." Philip had often asked himself whether anything could be done, but his distaste for any reference to the subject had prevented him from consulting any of the surgeons at the hospital. His reading told him that whatever might have been done when he was a small boy, and then treatment of talipes was not as skilful as in the present day, there was small chance now of any great benefit. Still, it would be worth while if an operation made it possible for him to wear a more ordinary boot and to limp less. He remembered how passionately he had prayed for the miracle which his uncle had assured him was possible to omnipotence. He smiled ruefully. I was rather a simple soul in those days, he thought. Towards the end of February it was clear that Cronshaw was growing much worse. He was no longer able to get up. He lay in bed insisting that the window should be closed always, and refused to see a doctor. He would take little nourishment, but demanded whiskey and cigarettes. Philip knew that he should have neither, but Cronshaw's argument was unanswerable. "I dare say they are killing me. I don't care. You've warned me. You've done all that was necessary. I ignore your warning. Give me something to drink and be damned to you." Leonard Upjohn blew in 2 or 3 times a week, and there was something of the dead leaf in his appearance which made the word exactly descriptive of the manner of his appearance. He was a weedy-looking fellow of 35, with long pale hair and a white face. He had the look of a man who lived too little in the open air. He wore a hat like a dissenting minister's. Philip disliked him for his patronizing manner and was bored by his fluent conversation. Leonard Upjohn liked to hear himself talk. He was not sensitive to the interest of his listeners, which is the first requisite of the good talker, and he never realized that he was telling people what they knew already. With measured words he told Philip what to think of Rodin, Albert Samain, and César Franck. Philip's charwoman only came in for an hour in the morning, and since Philip was obliged to be at the hospital all day, Cronshaw was left much alone. Upjohn told Philip that he thought someone should remain with him, but did not offer to make it possible. "It's dreadful to think of that great poet alone. Why, he might die without a soul at hand." "I think he very probably will," said Philip. "How can you be so callous?" "Why don't you come and do your work here every day, and then you'd be near if he wanted anything?" asked Philip dryly. "I? My dear fellow, I can only work in the surroundings I'm used to, and besides I go out so much." Upjohn was also a little put out because Philip had brought Cronshaw to his own rooms. "I wish you'd had left him in Soho," he said with a wave of his long, thin hands. "There was a touch of romance in that sordid attic. I could even bear it if it were Wapping or Shoreditch, but the respectability of Kennington! What a place for a poet to die!" Cronshaw was often so ill-tempered that Philip could only keep his temper by remembering all the time that this irritability was a symptom of the disease. Upjohn came sometimes before Philip was in, and then Cronshaw would complain of him bitterly. Upjohn listened with complacency. "The fact is that Carey has no sense of beauty," he smiled. "He has a middle-class mind." He was very sarcastic to Philip, and Philip exercised a good deal of self-control in his dealings with him. But one evening he could not contain himself. He had had a hard day at the hospital and was tired out. Leonard Upjohn came to him while he was making himself a cup of tea in the kitchen, and said that Cronshaw was complaining of Philip's insistence that he should have a doctor. "Don't you realize that you're enjoying a very rare, a very exquisite privilege? You ought to do everything in your power surely to show your sense of the greatness of your trust." "It's a rare and exquisite privilege which I can ill afford," said Philip. Whenever there was any question of money, Leonard Upjohn assumed a slightly disdainful expression. His sensitive temperament was offended by the reference. "There's something fine in Cronshaw's attitude, and you disturb it by your importunity. You should make allowances for the delicate imaginings which you cannot feel." Philip's face darkened. "Let us go into Cronshaw," he said frigidly. The poet was lying on his back reading a book with a pipe in his mouth. The air was musty, and the room, notwithstanding Philip's tidying up, had the bedraggled look which seemed to accompany Cronshaw wherever he went. He took off his spectacles as they came in. Philip was in a towering rage. "Upjohn tells me you've been complaining to him because I've urged you to have a doctor," he said. "I want you to have a doctor, because you may die any day, and if you hadn't been seen by anyone, I shouldn't be able to get a certificate. There'd have to be an inquest, and I should be blamed for not calling a doctor in." "I hadn't thought of that. I thought you wanted me to see a doctor for my sake and not for your own." "I'll see a doctor whenever you like." Philip did not answer, but gave an almost imperceptible shrug of the shoulders. Cronshaw, watching him, gave a little chuckle. "Don't look so angry, my dear. I know very well that you want to do everything you can for me. Let's see your doctor. Perhaps he can do something for me, and at any rate it'll comfort you." He turned his eyes to Upjohn. "You're a damned fool, Leonard. Why do you want to worry the boy? He has quite enough to do to put up with me. You'll do nothing more for me than write a pretty article about me after my death. I know you." Next day Philip went to Dr. Tyrell. He felt that he was the sort of man to be interested by the story, and as soon as Tyrell was free of his day's work, he accompanied Philip to Kennington. He could only agree with what Philip had told him. The case was hopeless. "I'll take him into the hospital if you like," he said. "He can have a small ward." "Nothing would induce him to come." "You know he may die any minute, or else he may get another attack of pneumonia." Philip nodded. Dr. Tyrell made one or two suggestions, and promised to come again whenever Philip wanted him to. He left his address. When Philip went back to Cronshaw, he found him quietly reading. He did not trouble to inquire what the doctor had said. "Are you satisfied now, dear boy?" he asked. "I suppose nothing will induce you to do any of the things Tyrell advised?" "Nothing," smiled Cronshaw. End of chapter 84. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.